Yes, now it's going.
Hi.
Are you sitting?
Actually, I thought he was. You're not going to sit here? I'll move over.
You want to slide over?
I'll slide over.
Yeah, if we slide over, we can get a couple people in here.
Oh, okay. I can sit someplace else, and that's it.
I'm sorry.
Well, I can go up there for my issues right now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Hello. Good evening, everyone. Well, we're going to get cozy tonight, I can tell. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us. This is the third year for our speaker series, and it's co-sponsored by our faculty senate and me. And I'm Dr. Suzanne Miles. I'm Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor of the college, and we're just so delighted to have you here tonight. A couple of things before we begin. If you could turn off your cell phones or pagers, that would be helpful. We do have several exits, and I want to point those out. We're going to keep those clear. There's one back here, one here, two over here, and one behind me right here. And the way this works is we do begin promptly at 6 o'clock, and the speaker typically goes for about 45 minutes, and then we open it up for questions, but we end promptly at 7 p.m. If there's some questions that we do not get to, our speakers, and in this case, David Idavaya, will stay afterwards and be happy to chat with you on an individual basis. I know some of you have brought in food and drink. Please do so. Disregard those signs. And if we get in trouble, just say the provost got us in trouble. With that, I'm delighted to turn this over to Dr. Dolores Duran-Cerda, President of Faculty Senate.
Thank you, Dr. Miles. Welcome, everyone. Are you ready for our wonderful lecture? Yes. Well, welcome to our first speaker series lecture of the spring semester. Tonight you will be hearing Pima Community College's Physics and Astronomy faculty member, David Idavaya. And he's going to take an astronomer's perspective to try to answer the question, what was the miracle of the sun? Have you heard of that before? Yes. The miracle of the sun was an event on when?
13 October.
Exactly, the 13th of October in 1917. More than 70,000 people who gathered near Fatima, Portugal, claimed to have witnessed an extraordinary solar activity. The sun danced and spun in the sky. It moved from its position and fell toward the earth, petrifying the crowd of people. I think that would be kind of scary. David established and designed the observatory and teaching planetarium at Pima's East Campus in 1989. He also established an online astronomy course with real-time telescope observation. David specializes in astronomical instrumentation and has done research in archaeoastronomy. His research has taken him to South America, Mexico, and throughout the American Southwest. David is active in the Arizona NASA Space Grant Education Program, which deals with near-space, high-altitude balloons. He is also a member of the American Astronomical Society, is a ham radio operator, and a sailor. David is also a pilot and currently flies RC model planes, and he also likes chocolate chip cookies. So David will give his lecture, and then he will take any questions you have at the end of his presentation. So please join Dr. Miles and myself in welcoming our distinguished speaker, David Idavaya.
let's see, I have an official gear here, so let's get started. Oh, lights. Yeah. I have, afterward, if you'd like to get a hold of me, all these years, and I don't have official college business cards, but I do have cards with my email address on them and the title of a book I wrote. It's available on Kindle. That's great.
Yeah, that's it.
That's good. Okay, can you all hear me if I back away from the microphone? Yes. Great. Yes? Oh, hello. Can you hear me in there? Can you hear me now? Hello. What was the miracle of the sun at Fatima in 1917? An astronomer's view. We're going to start with something to think about. You may have heard of Occam's razor. Well, he essentially said he was a priestly type guy. One should not increase beyond what is necessary the number of entities required to explain anything. Or, the simplest explanation is usually the best. So that's the premise we're going to start from. Fatima was a modern event, and what I did, I had this up here if you needed to follow along or just see it, it's fine. I'm not going to just read everything. I know it's helpful for people to read while I'm just rambling sometimes. But Fatima was a modern event, yet it is already clouded with the distortion of belief. Photographs of the object had disappeared. The key prophecy was suppressed. Lucia shut herself away from the world. As the years passed, the object was turned into a dancing sun, the angel hair became rose petals, and the entire phenomenon was removed from the field of science and entrusted to religion. So I will present some interesting facts about the miracle of the sun. This event was the culmination of an apparition of the Virgin Mary to 3 children in Fatima, a tiny village in Portugal. I've never been there, so I don't have first-hand knowledge of what it was like there. The event occurred at noon on the 13th of October in 1917, and I wasn't born yet. But this is the vein of science investigation. You usually deal with what someone else wrote about, and if you're lucky, you can do an experiment. And it was estimated by the local reports in various newspapers of the time that upwards of 70,000 people witnessed the event. The numbers range from 30,000 to 100,000. They really don't have a firm grasp on that. And then finally, I will pose a possible explanation of what took place. The event was given extensive coverage by the newspaper of the day, some of which were not sympathetic to anything that had to do with religion. So here's the story. It was foretold by 3 kids that a miracle was to happen at noon on the 13th of October in 1917. Jacinta, 7 years old, Francesco, he was 9, and Lucia was 10. However, the nature of the miracle was not known. They didn't know what was going to happen. So it all started with a visit in June of that year. Now, the quotes that are here are from a book by a priest, Father Di Marchi, who spent 7 years living in the village, interviewing people, trying to get to the bottom of what went on. So at the bottom of the, you'll see some references there so you know where this stuff's coming from. I didn't make anything up, I'm just presenting stuff. Okay? So he goes to say, they began to see in the distance above the trees that stretched to the east a light whiter than snow in the form of a young man, quite transparent and as brilliant as crystals in the rays of the sun. So according to another priest who was witnessing this, he speaks of a lady who came in an aeroplane of light, an immense globe flying westward at moderate speed. It irradiated a very bright light. Some other witnesses saw a white being coming out of the globe, which several minutes later took off, disappearing in the direction of the sun. They saw a lady, and she was so beautiful that they would never be able to describe this vision. and rather young. They estimated 16 years old. And when they saw this apparition, she was standing on the top branches of an oak tree. It looked that way, but it wasn't being bent, so obviously there was no mass involved, whatever they were seeing. And Lucia continued to write about the description of this apparition. This is what Father DeMarchi looks like, or looked like. He died January 1st, 2003. And by all accounts, he was a very pious, intelligent man, seeking to accurately report what had occurred. And he wrote a book, The True Story of Fatima, and it was published in 1956. And most of the quotes are from that book. Professor Valle stated that the crowd that stood in the field at Fatima, a small village, was some 62 miles north of Lisbon, on October 13th, 1917. They were waiting for a miracle because these three kids said that there was something going to happen. Because they had this meeting with this entity from the sky in a globe of light. So here are some of the eyewitness accounts of what happened at Fatima on local noon, 13 October 1917. This buzzing sound, referred to by one of the witnesses, had occurred prior to the actual event at Fatima the 13th. This started in June, and people who were there when the kids were supposedly seeing all this stuff, they're experiencing some buzzing sounds. And they're seeing these little globules or balls of light that were moving around, and they immediately attached significance to these objects. The sky was completely hidden behind the clouds. It started raining very, very severely. It was a strong wind, and people just got soaked to the bone, literally. And one of the events that happened, here's a photograph of that day. They are with umbrellas. If you've done any research of this, you'll see some photographs. It's quite a sunny day, and so then you have to wonder whose photograph it is. But this is the one from the newspapers of the time. And there were an awful lot of umbrellas in there. But if you wanted to count umbrellas, I guess that's the beginning of finding out how many were there. One of the professors of a local university estimated the crowd at 100,000, although he really had no means of gauging exactly how big a crowd it was. So the figures that the newspapers and reporters that were there settled on about 70,000, and some people come up with the fact that it might be 30,000. But the fact is, it's a lot of people. And the rains continue, and then all of a sudden, well past 1 government time, in other words, standard time, but by the sun, it is precisely noon. We're going to look at that because that's a bit of information that's interesting. And at that point, the rain stopped, the great clouds burst apart, the sun was obscured, but there was like a rainbow had exploded, according to some of the witnesses. And they were looking at this, and there was just something very unusual. And they see the sun hanging unchallenged in its place, as it was said, a strangely spinning disc of silver. This is an actual photograph that was taken of that day. Here's the sun, and we're going to see this photograph again, and I'm going to do some things with it that we do in astronomy with images. But this was the photograph, and the sun doesn't look like it's doing anything unusual. However, there is unusual stuff when you look at this, because the sun doesn't appear to be blazing bright. So then you would think, oh, maybe that's a negative of the photograph, but it isn't. When you look at a negative, everything is exactly the way a negative should be. So when they stared at the sun, some of the witnesses said it didn't strain the eye of any man to look at its unveiled light. The people could see the sun was strangely spinning. It began to revolve more rapidly, more frighteningly, and it began to cast off beams of many colored lights in all directions. Shafts of brilliant red came from the rim of the revolving star. And this impression of a blue-green glow in the environment, sort of like, I would think, just prior to the start of the monsoon, when you get the dust blowing and you look out and it's sort of that funny purpley-looking color. That's sort of what I imagined this to be when I read this passage. And witnesses claimed they could easily see the sun, and for some reason did not blind us. It seemed to flicker on and off, first one way, then another. It cast its rays in many directions and painted everything in different colors. That's an interesting statement that we're going to look at in a while. And then, all of a sudden, the sun appeared to stop spinning. And, according to the witnesses, it began to move and dance in the sky. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, midday by the sun, because obviously we have a time discrepancy here, but it really isn't when you look at it from an astronomer's point of view. The sky, pearly gray in color, illuminated the vast arid landscape with a strange light. The sun had a transparent, gazy veil, so that the eyes could easily be fixed upon it. The gray mother-of-pearl tone turned into a sheet of silver, which broke up as the clouds were torn apart, and the silver sun, enveloped in the same gazy, gauzy gray light, was seen to whirl and turn in the circle of broken clouds. So they were seeing something unusual happen. O Século was a Portuguese newspaper. It was very influential at the time. And a reporter, Alvino de Almeida, was there. And you'll see, you have to hit the right button for the link. So I'll have a little line there when it's Alvino that's being talking about. And he talks about the following. One could see the immense multitude turn towards the sun, which appeared free from clouds and in its zenith. Now, the word zenith in astronomical circles means something specific, and we're going to look at that in a while, but that's something you want to keep up there while we continue. And he saw, and this is his description of what happened. He saw a plaque of dull silver. This is the description of the sun that he saw. And it was possible to look at it without the least discomfort. And he concluded that it might have been an eclipse which was taking place. There was no eclipse on that day. He saw a clean-cut rim on the sun. It was very luminous, it was shiny, it didn't hurt the eyes. He thought this was unusual. And he didn't agree with many of the other people that were there who were actually seeing this. They described it as this pearly, gauzy-looking thing, and his was that it wasn't a dull silver. It was very, very clear and bright and crisp. It wasn't spherical like the moon, nor did it have the same color, tone, and shading. So he's comparing what he's seeing to the moon, thinking that he has some standard against which to see what was going on. And he said it couldn't be confused either with the sun seen through fog, for there was no fog at the time. It was not opaque, diffused or veiled. In Fatima, it gave light and heat, and it appeared clear-cut with a well-defined rim. Another curious thing that he noticed. The clouds passed from west to east. That's not curious. But did not obscure the light from the sun, giving the impression that the clouds were passing behind the sun. Now, this is interesting. Okay, this reporter has nothing to gain one way or another. He wasn't particularly religious, but he's trying to be an objective observer. And he noticed that these white tones started to take on various colors of pink and blue. And then he goes on and says that the phenomenon, except for two interruptions, when the sun seemed to send out rays of heat, which obliged us to look away, may have lasted about 10 minutes. So now he's got a time frame upon which a part of this event took place. And then he continues, the sun whirling wildly seemed to loosen itself from the firmament and advance threateningly upon the earth. So essentially saying the sun disconnected from the sky and is now heading toward the vast numbers of people watching this. Of course, if I was standing there, where would I be? I'd be watching. I'm a scientist. I want to say, oh, that's cool. And then I'd run. So then he goes on, he says, fearing that I was suffering from an infection of the retina. So he's realizing that maybe things aren't quite right. He's trying to justify what he's seeing that's not fitting into his understanding of how things should be. So he's thinking that his retina is being affected, and he turns away and he shuts his eyes and he puts his hands up in front of his eyes like that and puts his back like this. And then he opens his eyes again, and the landscape is still the same purple color as before. On the evening of that same October 13th, Father Manuel Pereira da Silva wrote to his friend and another priest, that the sun appeared with its circumference well-defined, this idea of this well-defined edge again. It came down as if to the height of the clouds and began to whirl giddingly upon itself like a captive ball of fire, with some interruptions. This lasted about 8 minutes. So now you've got an independent observer coming up with a time frame of 8 minutes. The reporter said 10 minutes when this activity was happening. So you've got two disconnected people coming up with a similar observation. I mean, that's usually a good thing if you're trying to track down who said what. The people, here's another curious thing, who had been drenched and soggy in the pelting unremitting rain, they were all dried up. They weren't dried up. They were dry from you don't just get dried up. That's not good. So their shoes, their stockings, their skin, and their everything, they were just dry. Now that's an interesting phenomena, and it may have had something to do with this heat that they described. Now, Father DeMarchi concludes the phenomenon, which was not registered in any astronomical observatory, and it wasn't. No astronomers at any observatory on the planet on that day saw anything unusual happening with the sun. So this is another important clue. He said that this couldn't have been of a natural origin. It was witnessed by people of every category and class, by believers as well as unbelievers, journalists of the principal daily papers, and even by people miles away, but not too far in terms of miles away, but far enough that he concluded that you didn't have a collective hallucination. Now, psychologically, I guess a couple of people can actually suffer from hallucinations, but psychologists will tell you they have to be under an immediate, huge amount of stress, like just about ready to die or something. Like they did some studies with coal miners who were trapped for 14 days at a time, and they would see the same hallucination, but they're ready to die, they think. So he's trying to destroy all the criticisms that might occur, and so he threw this idea out that this was not collective hallucination because people not at the location were seeing something. And then he goes on to say, you decide whether or not this was faulty eyesight by the people who were there. And he tried, but he couldn't find anyone to contradict or deny what had happened that day. So now we start looking at the bits of information that were given in these accounts. And the first question is, has the sun ever displayed a similar observed effect? And that is that one could look directly at the sun without discomfort. Now, of course, during an eclipse, you can do that during totality. Remember that. Don't go run out if there's a partial eclipse and look at the sun, because you might see some of the Fatima effects. All right. So now, on the 16th of May, 1816, very warm day, according to the author who wrote this little paper. And at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, the sun became dim, lost its brilliance to the degree that you could look at him. The idea of the sun's always a male, the moon will see as a female thing, right? I don't know why that is, but that's just the way it is. So you could look at the sun and not inconvenience, like the way they spoke in 1860, not inconvenience the naked eye. The sun being of dark red or almost bright in color. Now this phenomena lasted uninterruptedly upwards of 2 hours, and so it was such a long time, most of the people in the village saw this. Now the place occurred in a little village called Biskopfjordsberger, something like that. And where is that? There it is. It's somewhere near Austria, right there. See, just so you have an idea, Portugal right there. And here's Africa. And what is in northern Africa? The Sahara Desert. I mean, that's real desert. They just say we live in the desert here. What kind of desert has trees and things, right? When I moved here 30 years ago, I said, what desert? There's no desert here. All right, so why is this important? And how might that have affected this little town? Now, here we see from the reporter that clouds pass from west to east. So the prevailing winds apparently from west to east. And if we look at a graph of the prevailing wind, okay, whoa, back again. Here we go. Here is Portugal in this area. So you'd have a cyclonic rotation like this right off the Sahara, and then coming from the west to the east, carrying any dust. And this would indeed shield the sun enough so you can look at it directly and won't hurt your eyes. And the ancient Chinese have records of sunspot observations when the atmosphere was particularly dusty as the sun was setting or rising. You could see the sunspots. You could see the sun, or bigger sunspots. You could see them. So this is not an unusual thing, and so maybe that is what was going on there. Then he talks about the report of that is the phenomena, except for 2 interruptions when the sun seemed to send out rays of heat, obliged us to look away, and this lasted about 10 minutes. So the phenomena that was seen at Fatima wasn't 2 hours, it was about 10 minutes. Right? So that's interesting. Now, is there evidence of previous unusual aerial phenomena in religious connections? So let's take a look at that. And there may actually be some evidence that has been recorded in prehistoric drawings, medieval, and Renaissance paintings. I am not a historian of art, so you're going to get out of bias, naive art history, okay? Now, of course, what you ought to do is you go back and go home and research this yourself to see what you find out. So I just tell you that up front. So, one of the terms that comes out of a lot of ancient writings is Nephilim, Elohim, and Anunnaki. Now, depending on who's translating the original language, it could either mean giants, it's sometimes how the Nephilim is translated, or it could mean those who came from heaven to earth. Right? Now, these terms are found in the Old Testament and elsewhere. But of course, there's a lot of controversy as the interpretation of these terms. But they're out there. Now, a 14th century fresco of the Madonna and Child depicts at the top right side of the image an object hovering in the distance. If you blow up that little piece of scenery, this is what you see. Okay, 14th century. Now here's a little guy here with his dog, and they're looking up at whatever this is. You could say, well, that's just a crown or something that the artist put in there. And then you have other paintings. This is 1490 by an unknown artist, and you have some unusually shaped clouds that are appeared through the painting. These hat-like things. See all over there. And so you get something excited, maybe we'll have to something here. And here we have the Annunciation of Saint Emeritus in 1486, and here is an object, and it looks like a beam of light's coming down right to Mary's crown, chakra. Some of you know what that is. I don't know what that is, some chakra. All right, so let's take another point of view. Now, St. Jerome was a very important person in the early church in the 4th and 5th centuries in that time frame. Okay, and he was very important. He wasn't made pope, but if they had a position for him, like a cardinal, he probably would have been a cardinal. And of course, you may know that cardinals today wear these hats and the red robes and stuff, right? So you could see a cardinal from a mile away. They got a funny hat. And it looks like a hat in the paintings. So maybe what we're seeing is an icon of St. Jerome, represented by his hat. And he also was associated with a lion, and he tamed the lion that he met. So sometimes you see a lion in these pictures or the hat, and they're talking about St. Jerome. And the problem is they didn't make cardinals until well after the 10th century. So he could have never been a cardinal. But in the 13th century, 14th century, you have paintings with representation of St. Jerome as hats. And of course, some of you thought they looked like something else. So here we have the red hat. Okay, so this somehow is representing Saint Jerome. And it's not in the sky now; it's on the ground. And here is the hat again in the picture. And so you could say, oh, that's just an icon for Saint Jerome. And then there's a hat in this picture. And again, you could say it's an icon for Saint Jerome. And then, of course, there are frescoes all over Europe, and one interesting one called the Crucifixion painting, painted in 1315. It depicts a small human-looking man in this, whoa, back away. There we go. Hit the wrong button. I know you're all excited and looking for it. Here's the crucifixion, and you have two objects on either side, which in the iconic sort of representation was normal, and they would do things like this. But when you look at this, it looks like one object is unusual and is pursuing another one across the sky, and that's what they look like up close. And this is in the monastery in Kosovo. And if you look at these objects, here we go. You have two little twinkling stars on this one. One is supposed to, according to the iconic point of view, represents the sun, the male, and the other one represents the moon. And you can see the crescent shape of the moon. And it had to go back down with, I guess, with Diana in ancient Greek stuff. And but the thing is, looks like a guy. It doesn't look like a woman, right? So maybe they messed it up at that point. I don't know. But it's interesting. So many crucifixion paintings and mosaics done in the Byzantine style show these odd objects on either side of the cross, and they're representing the sun and the moon, and then ultimately they actually started to take on what the sun looks like and the moon looks like, and on and on. And the sun is on Christ's right, and the moon is on left, and that, I guess, was consistent through these types of paintings. Again, I'm not an art historian. What do I know? But I think these are interesting objects. Now, how about, do artists really do this? Do they put these little codes in the painting? So, I was in Peru doing some work in astronomy. I was at Machu Picchu trying to determine how, there's this one thing, it's called the Intihuatana stone. And the idea is that it was placed the way it was and carved out the way it was as some sort of a standard by which the locals could use that to look up at the sky and understand something about constellations or whatever. And a lot of what they did in Peru that was astronomically oriented had to do with the calendrical cycles of harvesting and planting. And of course, if you're familiar with any of that landscape, it's very mountainous, and they would plant at various altitudes. They got like about 10 million varieties of potatoes that they plant at each at different altitudes that does well. And of course, they have to run up and down to get this stuff out of the ground, and it's not easy work. So what do in Peru when you're in the Andes? You chew coca leaves. You go to Peru, you land in Cusco, the first thing they give you is coca tea. Okay? You can bring coca tea home, but you can't bring the coca plant. You get arrested and thrown in jail. Go figure. But the locals chew on this stuff because it gives them just enough buzz and keeps the oxygen going, and they're heart pounding, and they have a little saying, though the man who chews too many coca leaves will walk to his death. So they understood the dangers of it. And then they also have this other interesting drink that is made locally during these harvest festivals called chicha. Now, if you're in Lima, Peru, at a very fancy restaurant and you buy chicha, it's this purple sort of drink, and it's probably very expensive. And then what happens? You drink it and have fun. But I wanted the real stuff. I don't drink, but I wanted the real stuff. So here I am in this little village, and I want to find who's making the chicha. And there would be individuals making the chicha. And you could tell that they were participating because they have a bamboo pole sticking out of their place of their domicile. And hanging from it would be a piñata looking thing. Okay? So I'm walking around the village. I see the piñata, I get all excited. So I walk in, and of course, culture shock. You just walk into the house. You don't knock, there's no doorbell. You walk in, and there's sand on the floor and stuff, and there's the three women. They look like the witches of Bellwood and Campbell. And they're smiling. I come in, I don't speak much Spanish. I said, chicha? Chicha, they said. So, okay, I'm going to get some. So I just want un poquito, and they come up with this big thing of chicha. And it's yellow looking, right? It's not like the stuff you get in Lima. So I tasted, that's all I wanted to do, and I go back, and one of the locals that I was with, he was actually a federale, because during that time the Shining Path was running amok in Peru, and they were just taking people off the streets and hiding them for a while for ransom. So he was there, and there was this other guy who's about 90 years old, and he runs up and down the mountains like a goat, and smokes like a chimney. So there goes that theory. So anyhow, they said to me, they asked me, did you find chicha? I said, yeah, I found chicha. They started laughing, and they said, "Do you know what's in chicha?" And I said, yeah. They do the corn mash, whatever they're pulling off the hill. They make it into this little low-level alcoholic beverage, and they drink that along with chewing the coca leaf. And they started laughing, and they said, how did you see the women make it? He said, they're all around this big thing doing it. He says, you know what else is in there that you probably didn't know? I said, what? He went, all right, enough of that. Now, so, when you go into the houses, I went into this house, here I see all these cute little guinea pigs running around. And I'm thinking, how cute, they have pets. Well, that's like a herd of cows. That's food, that's lunch. Right? Now you go to Peru, and that's a cuy. That's like a delicacy, but they've been eating this stuff for a long time. So now, what's that have to do with the artists and icons? So you go into the Cusco chapel or cathedral in Cusco, and there's a painting. Now, an interesting fact is when the Spanish came in and conquered the place, the Indians didn't want anything to do with it. As a matter of fact, Spanish is the official language there, but the Indians up in the mountains still speak Quechua, and that's their language. They don't care what the official language is. So they have all these little things. And in 1700, an artist painted a picture of the Last Supper, and he was sort of going to get his digs in. And look at what's in the plate. And they're probably drinking chicha to wash it down. So again, artists do such things in their paintings. We just have to understand where they're coming from. So let's do an analysis of this and see what we can come up with. We have to look at observations of similar phenomena that were described by the various witnesses. We're going to look at something called solar retinopathy. Did I say it correctly? Retinopathy? Yeah, there you go. Yep. You understand that physical scientists has a very limited vocabulary, which is why we go into physics and such. If our vocabularies were extensive, we'd become psychologists. Now, are there other disk shapes similar to what was seen? And we're going to look at the altitude of the sun at the time when this activity was occurring. And we have to deal with the time discrepancy. And then also the effect of parallax. Now, let's do a little experiment. Now, no cheating, and do this. It's fun. Thumb. Cover my face with your thumb and close one eye and just cover my face with your thumb. All right, hold that. Now, when I tell you, I want you to open the closed eye and close the open eye, but leave your thumb exactly covering my face. Ready? Go. Switch. Okay, do you see how I magically jumped? That's called parallax. We're going to look at that as it applied to this activity. And, of course, we had lots of witnesses. And then I'm going to do some basic image processing on the actual photograph. So let's look at the observations of similar phenomena. Okay, according to the witnesses of Fatima, shafts of brilliant red came from the rim of the revolving star. In 1989, an officer in Belgium looked at some unusual thing in the sky that was emitting these red beams of light. The buzzing sound that the people at Fatima associated with the introduction of this whole series of activities in June. In September 1961 in New Hampshire, a couple of people heard a buzzing sound that was associated with some object that they had encountered. An astronomer in 1883 was doing an observation, and he set up his equipment. The sun had set from some while ago, and the horizon started to brighten up. And he thought the moon was rising, but the moon wasn't rising. There was just this brightening of the horizon, and he had no idea what was happening. Now, this one's an interesting one. This is what happens when you stare at the sun. Apart from decreased vision, the patient may also experience distortion of vision, a black spot, altered colored vision, after images and headache, in spite of a generally good prognosis. Return of vision does not always imply complete recovery, as the patient might keep on experiencing any of the above symptoms. You could have persistent black spots and image distortion, which would drastically reduce the reading performance in some patients. In July 1987, a 33-year-old woman went to the hospital. She complained of black spot in front of her right eye. In May of 1987, she was on a pilgrimage to Medjugorje, which is another one of these holy sites, and she stayed at the sun at 7 p.m. intermittently for a few minutes. And look at what happened. While she was doing so, the sun had danced and changed colors from orange to black to white. When she looked away, her vision was blurred, and then she had an after image in her eye. Gradually, with time, her vision improved, but the black spot persisted. Don't stare at the sun. 2009, 10,000 of the faithful gathered at the Catholic Knox Shrine in Ireland. And they stared at the sun because a charlatan named Joe Coleman told them to do so. And here we have the account from a 53-year-old who said, I never witnessed the sun go like that before. I witnessed the sun while I was staring at the sun go all different colors, yellow, red, and green. Then it completely darkened and began shimmering. Sometimes the sun emitted a clean, bright light, then it would darken again. So obviously, if you stare at the sun, you're going to have effects that are real, and they're going to, looks like, create some of the descriptions that some of the people at Fatima talked about. Other disc shapes. Have other people seen disc shapes? An astronomer, Percy Wilkins, he's claimed to fame as he did the first lunar maps, photographic lunar maps that we used ultimately by the Apollo program to pick landing spots. Now, there was a guy in Tucson, Whitaker, who did the same thing, and he made improvements on this earlier stuff. But in 1954, he saw two silvery objects like polished metal plates moving across or against the wind. A third grayish oval marked across the sky. And then the reporter at Fatima said, I saw it as a disc with a clean cut rim, luminous and shining, but which did not hurt the eyes. I do not agree with the comparison, which I have heard in Fatima, that of a dull silver disc. It was clean, right, a richer, brighter color, having something of the luster of pearl. Now, how about the altitude of the sun? So if this was occurring, I could go back in time and calculate where the sun was. And if you look at the people, if you look at that angle, it's about what? What do you think? 45 degrees close to 45? That's what I thought too. He said, this guy. There's always one. So you calculate the altitude of the sun, and on that day and time, it's about 43 degrees. So people are more or less looking in the general direction. The time discrepancy. The clock, the silver clock, said that it was well past 1 o'clock in the afternoon. But by sun time, it is precisely noon. Any guesses? What's the first thing pops in your head if it's supposed to be noon and it's 1 o'clock? Daylight savings time. Yes, daylight savings time was in effect at that time. We didn't invent it. It was there for a while. And sure enough, you can find that Lisbon, they were just on it. The next day they went off daylight savings time. So Portugal was on daylight savings time in 1917. So the clock time was 1 hour ahead of standard. So that takes care of the 1 p.m. thing. But what about well past? Well, if you go by the sun, see, the only real clock is the sun. We've invented standard time because we want to get one place to another on time, unlike students that they show up whenever. So they haven't gotten these things. But they're working on it. So what causes this? Well, if this time is determined by the sun, use a sundial. And the sundial is true to the clock in the sky, the sun. When, and this is interesting, remember the word zenith? Okay. Zenith in astronomy means, whoa, back up. There we go. Hit the wrong button. It's very narrow. The zenith is over your head. It could also mean, when you're talking about a celestial object, it's the highest point. It's called the culmination, as this thing is arcing across the sky. Because you all know that the Earth is really rotating. That's why the sky looks like it moves, right? Right? What would it look like if the Earth didn't rotate and the sky really did move? look the same. See, so that was a tough one for a long time to figure that one. All right. It could also mean the highest point, the culmination. What time is it when the sun is at its highest point as it moves across the sky? Noon. Okay, that's when it's called on the meridian. And you already know this stuff because you know AM and PM. AM, ante-meridian, PM, post-meridian. What's that all about? The sun is on the east side of the meridian, before the meridian, ante, post, after. And then right at noon, boom, it's on the meridian. So we took care of the, now we talk about the equation of time. When our clocks are a little fast or slow compared to the sun, they say the sun is fast or slow compared to our clocks. For the 13th of October, it's about 14 minutes. And so that then puts it well past 1. So astronomically speaking, the sun was doing its thing, and whatever occurred there exactly at the time it was supposed to occur. So from an astronomical perspective, it did occur at that time. Parallax. A guy named Bonilla, an astronomer of Mexico, was looking at the sun properly with his telescope properly filtered in 1886, and he noticed an unusual thing. He noticed objects moving across the face of the sun. Now, unfortunately for him, no one else did, but he did have his camera, and he had it attached to the telescope, and sure enough, that's an actual picture that was taken in 1886 of this object. And he saw about 450 of them. Now, of course, when you're using your eye, it's a lot better than the picture. Cameras weren't that good. Film wasn't that good. They didn't have plastic film. And, of course, they didn't have digital stuff. But he took his picture and he wrote an article that was published in a French astronomical journal. And he couldn't account for the phenomenon, neither could the editors of the journal. And they thought it was rather incredulous, and that the people who reviewed his article, although they published it, said he probably was seeing insects flying in front of his telescope. All right, so here's sort of a better picture of it. And just to show you what the state of the art of photography at that time, here's a first picture of the moon in 1839. So it's fairly nice. And this in 1882, Vassar was on a trip to look at the transit of Venus, which, by the way, happens this year. And if you miss it this time, it's going to be 132 years before it happens again. So June 4th, I think. I don't remember. You don't want to miss it. You can see from Tucson. So you can see the resolution. Oh my God. The resolution is sufficient to see Venus on the disk of the sun. And what they think Bonilla saw that was a comet that had broken up. And we know comets do that. It's comet Schwarzman 3 in 2006 that broke off, and you see these pieces. So now the question is, how come nobody else saw what Bonilla saw? And the reason is this idea of parallax, that the object was much closer to him than to anyone else, and because of this parallax effect, he happened to be in the right place at the right time, and no one else happened to be looking that would have maybe seen it. And so it's not that it didn't happen, but because of parallax, only people in a very confined area would have seen the effect. So it's possible that if an object is very close to the observer, it would appear as a local event. And that might explain why only those at Fatima in that specific location and within several miles of it could see whatever was going on there. It must have been very close to the observers. And they were, of course, lots of witnesses. This is, whoa. This is that guy's brother. Remember the one? I found out. I researched that. It's his brother. All right, let's do some basic image processing on the actual image. There's the image. And then what I'll just a simple contrast and brightness enhancement. And so I do this, and you start seeing the sun is not getting any brighter. It's actually getting dimmer. But the clouds around the sun, what you get a sense of the reflection of the sun's light as a function of the thickness of the cloud cover. All right, so the sun now, as I'm enhancing this image, is starting to get darker instead of brighter. This is not a negative. So I said, okay, I have to do the experiment. So I started out with photographing the sky on a day, luckily in Tucson. It was cloudy, and I said, that probably would have looked like a Fatima, so I'm going to get my camera out. So I started with a color image, and then didn't have color paper then, so I made it black and white. And then I enhanced this. And you can see that as you do this, you can get a sense of the various densities of the cloud based on the reflectivity. Okay? So then I said, all right, I'm going to, now the sun's hiding in here. The sun's hiding in those clouds, and with basic techniques, we'll just go black and white, and look, you can see where the sun is, right? Right there, right? And so then I'm going to enhance it again to the same level I did the original photograph, and it doesn't get darker, it gets brighter, see? So that's rather curious. So something was amiss. So there is the enhanced version of Fatima, and there's the enhanced version of me. Or not me. There's the original again. So, conclusion. I'm only 5 minutes off, only because you took 5 minutes to introduce me. So I'm on time. Because I go on solo time. Conclusion. Ready? So what do we learn from these images? It was still a mostly cloudy sky with patches of clear sky. The area around the sun seems to be covered by clouds. So it seems as if the sun is still behind clouds. The cloud cover consisted of varying cloud thicknesses, as you can see in the variations of the reflectivity of the sun's light. So from witnesses' statements and the photographic evidence, a possible explanation results. While it seems that the people were indeed looking toward the sun's direction, the sun may have been covered by clouds, and since the event was seen within several miles of the location but not observed elsewhere, we can firmly say nothing happened to the sun on that day. So satisfying Occam, the simplest explanation could be that there must have been an object between the observers and the sun. I rest my case. But I'm not going to. Question time. So, questions?
Well, the prophecy was that it would happen that day. That's kind of a coincidence, isn't it?
I have no idea. All I do is just present the stuff, and then you decide what you'd like to do with it.
So it was not the Virgin Mary.
I have no idea. All I do is present.
From the island they call the Azores. And I always want to go to Fatima. It would be very cold and afford it. And in order to go from where I come from, it's 800 miles. You got to go by boat or by plane. So I came to this country, and me and my wife, we had a daughter, and she was 9 years old. She used to say, "Mom and Dad, I wish I had a brother or sister." So she had an operation. The doctor said it's very impossible to have another child. So then I told my wife, we're going to have adopt a child. And then, but before we could do that, so we went shop around. And about 6 months we would have. So we went. But I was going to go to Fatima. This time she was for American Airlines. So we got free transportation. So when we came back, they came and said, in 6 months you're going to have a little girl the same age. Then she says she's going to have a baby. So that he opened that. Why?
Because the three kids told them something's going to happen.
And you believe them?
Yeah, don't you believe three kids when they tell you something's going to happen? I believe my kids when they tell, because when they say something's going to happen, they probably got into trouble.
I was wondering if it could have been a zeppelin from Germany, and that would also count for buzzer noise and it not being spherical.
That's something to research. Again, all I do is just tell you what I saw.
My father in a ranch, very poor ranch in the St. David and Benson area. Himself and my aunt, who's two, they're called primas hermanas, cousins. They grew up together. They were sitting on the porch. It was, I don't know what time of day it was, but he said that when they looked at the moon, they saw a cross on the moon on that day, and they were thousands of miles away. And my dad had an unexplainable in his palate, like a cross, that the doctors at the VA hospital could never explain.
Those are interesting stories, but again, anyone with questions about it?
I was going to ask you, I've seen on TV, I've heard that a lot of people are watching, they look at the sun directly, and that's what they're doing.
You'll see dancing sun in colors, and you won't be able to read very well.
Of the 10, 20, 70,000 people, how many suffered true heart attack?
I don't know. I don't have that information, and I don't think it actually recorded it. But and then people didn't run to the doctors in 1917 in Portugal. We just toughed it out. So anyone else?
There was a question.
How come we don't have one of those microphones that they have at football games? They just fly.
What about the heating effect that was claimed?
Yeah, again, that's a sticky point for a lot of people that try to debunk this activity, because they just sort of avoid talking about it because they just don't know. Now, a couple of people tried to deal with this, sort of like you may have experienced something similar when there's a high humidity, temperature drops, humidity goes down, and you dry off. Might have been something like that. But if you have 30, 70,000 people in one small area, yeah, it's going to be very interesting. So, again, I just give you the data and you decide. Anyone else?
I think there was a question in the back.
What's the question about the heating?
Oh, okay.
Good exercise.
I have no idea. You have to ask somebody who works there. I actually had a nun that was a cousin of mine, actually worked in the Vatican. But why did Lucia get whisked away to the Vatican? I don't know. Any other question? Yes.
So the basic result of your work was that it wasn't the sun that they were looking at. It was some object between them and the sun.
That's what it seems to be when you look at the data and you just try to take an objective look at it. It looks like something was there that they were looking at. I'm not going to tell you what that is. I don't want to know what the called the crackpot. But the data is there, and it's very interesting. Any other questions?
So we know that it was a local event. So we know that it was a local event. The sun was not involved. A lot of people saw this, and also we know that it was not mass illusion. So we don't know the ultimate cause.
Well, isn't science like that? When we study nature, we never know the ultimate cause. All we do is we try to figure things out and give up a definition. If any of you would like to pick up one of these with my email address and website, you can, and send me questions, and I'll be glad to respond to you. And I love chocolate chip cookies.
Board of Governors member here present with us, Marty Cortez, right here.